Year Lumikha, let us all give a warm round of applause for Mr. Harry Fozzard. Next up is the country manager of the Nile.com.au, Mr. David Pritchard. She is the head of communications of Hopla Online, Miss May Lani Chan. Moderating our panel discussion for this afternoon is Payoneer Senior Director for Customer Success, Miss Karen Anab. Panelists, Miss Karen, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you for joining the panel. We are here to discuss because the landscape of online outsourcing and freelancing is evolving and changing. You've seen a few examples for the people that spoke before of how many things this industry is going through. We're having more and more customers from US, UK, Europe, Australia that are interested to outsource a part of their services. But on the other hand, we also have more and more service providers, freelancers, agencies, BPO, that are interested to provide these services. So now the competition is getting fiercer, and it's important more than ever to get to know who is our customers, who is looking for our services. This will allow us not only to gain new customers, but also to increase the retention from our existing customers and to increase their satisfaction. So today we are very fortunate to have with us three amazing panelists that will share with us their perspective on what customers are looking for and what is important for our customers. And I will let you guys introduce yourself. So, please, May.
Yeah, hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is May Lani Chan, and I'm the head of communications for Hopla. Hopla is a remote outsourcing solution, so we employ people globally, but we have definitely a lot of remote professionals that are sitting in Manila as well as in different remote provinces in the Philippines.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's David Pritchard and I'm country manager for the Philippines office of the Nile.com.au. That's the Nile like the river. We are an Australian retailer of baby accessories, toys, books, homewares and similar items. And here in the Philippines we don't do any retail, but we have our own in-house captive BPO operation that services our parent company, doing things like customer support, order management, data and related service activities.
Hi, my name's Harry. I'm the managing director for Atelier Lumikha. We're a boutique BPO based in Dumaguete. So I guess I'm one of the few Visayan representatives here today. We focus mostly on marketing and customer service. We started in Manila. Our pedigree is about 20 years old. Worked in the mid-tier of the BPO game. Worked for a company that got up to about 10,000 seats before they consolidated, and we kind of spun out and did our own thing.
Thank you for your introductions. I'd like to start by asking you general questions for the three of you. Then I will ask a bit more individual questions based on your company and your experience. And if time will allow, we will also be glad to get questions from the audience. So starting from the first question, Philippines is one of the biggest countries in the world for outsourcing and freelancers. Other than the language and the cost benefit, what do you think are the main reasons that customers choose to outsource to Philippines?
Okay, if I may start. Yeah, other than the surging economy of the Philippines in the last year, I believe, in the last years, I believe that having a younger general population in the Philippines contributes a lot to that. So I think the value is at 22 or something. So having that younger population, you have a hungry, determined workforce, and this workforce also are very exploratory in terms of technological advancements. They're even innovators or pioneers of different apps, of new apps that are just surging every day. And And yeah, this, I think, being techie savvy is something that the outsourcing industry would benefit a lot from the workforce. Especially the type of outsourcing, if I may, the new wave of outsourcing that we do at Hopla. It's called distributed outsourcing, so it sort of sits in between the traditional outsourcing where you still have that recruitment process where we believe that human involvement is also necessary to make the match between the client and the remote worker. But also, you are not limited to the workforce that are currently in the big cities. So our remote professionals sit in even the far-flung places, so long as so long as you can be reached by the internet. Therefore, we have a more diverse workforce. We have that advantage. And you would really be surprised how a lot of talented writers and even video editors and those that does not require to report to the office, there's a lot of talent in the remote places in the Philippines. And also, so I was saying in between the traditional BPO and the freelancers, where usually freelancers are on their own, so they have to build their own processes, they have to use their own tools, they have to choose their own tools. For us, we provide that for our remote workers. So we have constant management support. We introduce them to tools that we ourselves use, like Payoneer. So yeah, so that's what distributed outsourcing is, and I think being techie savvy, having that young generation contributes a lot to the development of that.
Yeah, everything she said, I think that's all very true. From the perspective of a company in, say, Australia or New Zealand, where I'm from, the basic case for outsourcing is pretty obvious, as I think the question laid out. Everyone's offering cost savings. And so you have to weigh it up. Different countries, India, obviously the biggest player in the global market. You've got the Philippines, and then you've got emerging players like, for example, South Africa and a few other countries that are Latin America as well, making an effort with outsourcing. So the question is, what does the Philippines offer specifically? Language was already mentioned, I think. That's the obvious one everyone says. It's something like the fifth, I think, largest English-speaking country in the world. But I think it's beyond just the English-speaking capacity. I think there is a cultural affinity that Filipinos have that appeals to people in the West. You've got a unique situation here where it's part of the developing world, and so labour is affordable, but you have people that have, I guess, as a result of the colonial history, which isn't always a good thing, but one benefit is that you have quite a westernized culture. And when, for example, Australians are talking to Filipinos, they relate more. They seem more like us, I guess you would say. And that's a huge advantage because you're communicating with these people. And you have to be able to, just beyond giving simple instructions, you have to understand that the person really gets you in a broader sense. So the cultural affinity, I think, is a major advantage the Philippines has. And then, of course, you've got things like time zones. So again, I speak from the perspective of someone from Australasia, so it makes a huge difference if you can talk to someone in the same time zone. Any of you that have to talk to the United States, there's almost no overlap between time zones. And it's surprising how frustrating that gets. Like, you want to go and finish work at the end of the day. You don't want to have to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning to have a phone call with somebody. And then you sort of lose time because you send an email and you don't get a response until the next day. If you can have that real-time communication, it makes a huge difference. And so that's what seems in some ways like an obvious advantage. Actually, you realize how big of an advantage it is when you're trying to work closely with teams abroad day in, day out, is the time zone. So the two factors that I would identify would be cultural affinity and also just the geographic proximity for markets like Australia, which has a smaller uptake of outsourcing. So it's obviously a growth area that this country needs to focus on. So those are really great factors to start with. And then I guess the last thing I would say is the untapped potential. It's amazing to think that there is it like almost 100 million people in this country. And You know, you've got all these, it's been spoken about by the earlier panelists, you've got all these parts of the country that are totally untapped, you know, massive resources of workforce and educated people with all sorts of skills, and as an earlier speaker spoke about, you know, they're educating themselves on YouTube, they're learning, they're equalizing, they're picking up these skills, and so much of it is still untapped. I have a friend that was looking for a software developer, and I said, it can be hard to find the right developer here, and he said, I don't care. You've got 100 million people here, I guarantee that person is out there, I just need to find them. So the untapped potential of the Philippines is also a major advantage that people are looking at, and it needs to be promoted, and people need to be educated about it.
Well, I guess, I mean, in addition to the demographics that both my predecessors alluded to, you know, there is just the scale of available talent in the Philippines and the ongoing supply of talent that keeps expanding and expanding both in the urban areas and in the provincial areas. I think that you know, kind of what underlies the Western affinity, you know, for me is just the absolute, you know, familiarity with the diaspora of people from the Philippines that are in English-speaking countries. So, you know, for example, almost everyone has met or has worked with or has interacted with someone from the Philippines. And as the outsourcing phenomenon has become, you know, more commonly known amongst business people throughout the world, all that starts to begin to create connections. And I believe that that's a big part of how the Philippines emerged as an outsourcing destination. You know, everyone knows somebody firsthand or knows somebody who knows somebody who's worked with or has a Filipino colleague on some level. And I think that's a big trigger, that's an important trigger. But I think if you look back into the history of outsourcing to the Philippines, that I mean, the Philippines outsourcing phenomenon was a very thoughtful activity as the Philippines entered that market space. I mean, 20 years ago, you know, outsourcing in the Philippines was not a big phenomenon. Everyone thought India had it. They'd been doing it for 10, 15 years, doing it for GE. The ongoing logic was you couldn't do outbound from the Philippines. It was only customer service and only boutique customer service at that. You know, and a few guys really changed the perception. You know, the guys at Telecare, Ambergris Solutions, People Support, companies that have been acquired and rolled up. But you know, those organizations really created a mindset that could happen, and they were, you know, almost the, you know, the missionaries out there getting the job done. And then, you know, the Philippines developed a governmental perspective to attract outsourcing. You know, ICT, DTI, BPAP, PEZA, all those things kind of worked hand in glove to bring outsourcing to the Philippines. And now, you know, for this community, you know, that's all that's all trickling down and pervading into the, you know, the common understanding of how we deliver services here. And I believe that's a big trigger for the phenomenon here, because I'll bet that a lot of people who are in this audience right now started out in bigger BPO organizations and then decided they could get out and do it on their own.
Thank you. So the customer chose Philippines. Now when he wants to choose a service provider, his freelancer, what criteria do you think he's looking at? What is important for him to evaluate? And if I may ask also, what is the most important one?
I think for a client, there are three things that he needs to, that is usually being considered. Flexibility for one, the ability to start small, to tap into, to test the waters first, if you may. So usually clients would start with a virtual assistant, and then they would scale through. So that's flexibility and also scalability, and finding that. So if you, for example, are building a website, you need a website developer, and then eventually a website a programmer, a content writer. So being able to scale through this vast remote workers and have that sort of a one-stop shop is, I think, another criteria that a client is looking for an outsourcing provider. Also, another thing is how can this outsourcing provider add value to their company? So what sort of tools do you use? What sort of talent do you provide? Those three things.
This was the question about freelancing versus outsourcing, right?
Question about what criteria do you use to evaluate?
Oh,
Who do you
criteria to evaluate,
choose?
right, pardon me. That's a really interesting question. Again, there's the obvious stuff, and I alluded to the fact that people talk about cost. But for me, and this applies both to when you're evaluating a company, a potential service provider, or someone that you're going to hire as an employee, is how do they handle failure? How do they handle mistakes? How do they handle things when things go wrong? There's nothing worse than having someone in front of you that basically projects overconfidence and tells you that they can immediately deliver and you don't need to worry, it's going to be perfect, nothing's ever going to go wrong. A question I often ask people is, tell me about a mistake you've made. Tell me about a time, your successes are very interesting to me, but tell me about something that really didn't work the way you expected. Tell me about a screw up. And I'm interested to know what happened and how you dealt with it. Because the reality is everybody screws up sometimes. Things don't always go to plan. In the case of an employee, you might have some kind of initiative and it completely falls over or fails. You might just fail to hit your targets because something you didn't expect came along and bowled it over. And it is an aspect, I think, of the culture in the Philippines culturally that people need to really work around, because there's a face-saving instinct here where you don't want to admit to failures and you just want to project this perfection to people. And the reality I find is when I ask that question, like for example, if I'm looking to hire a recruiter, I say, so tell me about a recruiting decision you made that you really regret, where you just got it wrong. And the reality is literally 95% of people I speak to and ask that question when I'm interviewing them, they actually find it almost impossible to tell me the answer. And they'll give me a sort of a fake answer, or another variant is like, like a mistake you've made, and they say, oh, a mistake I made is that I worked too hard, I was just so dedicated to my company that I put my personal life aside and I should have spent more time. And what they're really doing is just sort of sneakily trying to tell you that actually they're a really hard worker and so you should hire them. So you get a lot of responses like that, and it's only a very small number of people, and this applies to employees, to companies, that will literally be open with you and just be candid and say, actually, yeah, this is a time that I really screwed up. And here's what I did about it. I was responsible, here's how I responded, here's how I figured out, here's how I learned from that mistake. And so that degree of candor is really, really important, and I often find when businesses are pitching to me in this country, again, when I'm hiring employees, they are quite averse to that degree of candor. And everyone can tell you about your bottom line and what they offer to do, but if they can be that open about it, and also the second thing I would say is make an effort to understand your business. Right? If someone comes and says, "Oh, I can double your profits," doesn't matter, I can do it. If they don't understand your business, then that's obviously nonsense, right? But if they make a real effort to understand the nuts and bolts and get their minds under the hood of your business, that tells you that they're a much more resilient and much more interesting entity or person to deal with. So beyond the obvious stuff that just goes on to a prospectus, just think about those two aspects. I would isolate those as probably really the deciding factor for me when I'm deciding whether I want to do business with somebody or hire somebody.
So, in my experience, both hiring and being hired, I believe that there's really only one essential component in the decision-making process, and that's trust. Particularly given being generally offshore and very remote from your clients, being able to develop a level of rapport and candor. Trust is the shorthand. Can they trust you to do the job? Can they trust you to be candid when things aren't going well? Can they trust you to be the kind of partner in an outsourcing relationship that can work with them over time to bring off a project or an ongoing program. So to me, that's really the critical thing that we work on, both as a client and as a vendor.
Thank you for the very different and interesting perspective. And if you look today, so it's becoming easier to outsource. We see companies like Upwork that are making everything very easy, very accessible. So, so we have companies that are growing from being individual freelancers to BPOs and agencies. And my question to you is, why would a customer prefer to work with an individual versus agency, or vice versa? What guides the choice in that?
All right. First, I think everyone nowadays wants everything fast, with technology, fast food, and whatnot. And having that flexibility with a freelancer, where you can just basically click a finger and you already hired someone. That's one thing that the clients actually veer towards the freelance module. Another thing is that a lot of clients, especially when they're just starting up, they don't want to commit into something like us. We don't want to commit into a lot of things. Yeah. So having to work with a BPO, with an agency, you would actually go through that whole process of having a contract and through the process of employment, recruitment, and hiring. With the freelancer, that is usually fast forward. And so that makes them decide to go through a freelancer. But I believe more and more clients nowadays find the benefits of having that dedication, which you cannot really find so much in a freelancer. So usually freelancers hop from one job to another, and sort of in the process they lose their focus on one particular business or client. And I think clients nowadays see the importance of having that dedication, which creates productivity from your employee and therefore success for your business.
So again, speaking purely from a client's perspective, which is mine, I mean, we don't sell outsourcing services or freelancing, but when we were looking to take care of some of our operational requirements better, like for example, customer support, I guess we explored freelancing a little bit, but it's something that we haven't used much. We made a decision when we came to the Philippines that we were going to essentially run things in-house and have our own team under one roof. The downside of that, of course, is that you have all sorts of additional costs. You have to run payroll and learn about the labor code and all these kind of things, and you have overheads. And freelancing gets away with a lot of those problems. You don't really have an issue there. Freelancers only get paid for delivering, usually, which certainly works. But for us, the major advantage was control. So when we have everyone under the same roof and we're managing them ourselves, we can see more what's going on. Culture, culture matters for an organization, and so we want our customer support people not just to, for example, in the case of inbound customer support, answer emails. We want them to project our brand and to project our company culture to the organization. And I imagine that's quite difficult if you're trying to do something like that from a freelancing approach. We invest a lot in creating a family environment for our employees, teaching them about the message of our company, the kind of image we want to project to our customers, and having people there, sitting there, working together day in, day out makes a big difference. And the other major factor is knowledge sharing. I think one of the panelists spoke about that earlier. I mean, the best way that we make our employees more productive is identifying the top performers and then getting them to share their tips and their tricks and their techniques with the other employees. They call it best practice sharing. It's a form of knowledge sharing. And I guess that can be facilitated through freelancing, through some of the online platforms and different tools that are available now. But for me, there's no substitute to actually having these people coming in, day out, and sitting next to each other under the same roof, chatting with each other over lunch and afterwards. You know, a lot of the most important discussions and revelations and things that happen in a business are usually off the clock, right? When people are socializing a little bit and talking a little bit about personal stuff, a little bit about the business. Some of the best things come out of that. So there are a lot of aspects like that having more of a traditional outsourcing approach where you have people sitting at desks together benefit. Whereas other things, like for example, maybe discrete things like graphic design, you know, data processing and things like that, I can certainly see the benefit of freelancing there. But the route that we took was very much the in-house BPO approach.
Just out of curiosity, how many people here would consider themselves freelancers? And then how many would consider themselves more of an agency structure? Okay, so I had come here prepared to basically pile on with my co-panelists on the freelancers because we sell against it all the time. But I think what I'll do is I'll take maybe the freelancing perspective because we do sell against it. You know, it's part of when you're a boutique BPO, you kind of think about all the people that you're competing with on the platforms like Fiverr and Upwork. And I use Fiverr extensively. So just thinking about the kinds of the ways in which people might make that decision versus an agency. You know, I think it has everything to do with the, you know, kind of the client's proclivity, right? So a decision-making process. I would venture to say that, you know, I mean, one of the points that we heard earlier is that you get paid on performance when you're freelancing. You know, it's a very, you know, rigorous sort of transactional relationship that sort of contemplates, you give me this and I'll pay you for it. Whereas most agency relationships work a little bit more on a ongoing or retainer structure, or you know, some sort of go forward kind of billing. So I think in a lot of ways, it really has everything to do with the way the client is focusing on the marketplace. So I think a lot of clients come to offshore outsourcing through the platforms like Upwork and Fiverr, may not be conscious of how many people are actually offshore in that environment. You know, I don't know if it answers the question, but I think that there are ways in which to develop long-term relationships as freelancers, and that can, you know, benefit, I think, a fair number of the audience here.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask you now a bit of individual questions, maybe starting with you, Harry, just to diverse a bit.
Okay.
As you saw, we have many individual freelancers in the audience that some are looking to expand their business, growing to agency or potential BPOs. Could you share some tips with them on how to grow successfully in smart growth?
Yeah, you need to do everything you can to increase your pain threshold if you're growing your business. Just kidding. Once you take on payroll, life changes for you. It's like having children or something. But to me, the key components are, you know, hire like your life depends on it, because it does. Because those are your colleagues and those are the people that will help you scale at the end of the day. So it's a little bit cliche in the world of startups about hiring, but you really can't be too careful about the people that you bring into your organization, because you're trusting them in such an implicit way to work with the clients that you've built up. In the course of expansion and growing, don't be afraid to do the hard work of documentation and training. You know, I think that's, you know, everyone pays a lot of lip service to training, and, you know, almost no one does it right. And, you know, the value of training multiplies exponentially with the number of employees you have. So, you know, when guys like Andy Grove, you know, the CEO of, you know, Intel, who really grew that business and is responsible for so much of the current best practices in Silicon Valley, you know, when that guy says in his book, training is the most important thing you can do, you can believe that training is the most important thing you can do. And then I think the last thing that's important about scaling is to be really mindful of who your market is and who your audience is. You know, Seth Godin just wrote a new book on marketing. I think he does that every other week. But in that book, he talks about the minimum viable audience. And what he's talking about is finding the audience of people that you can serve better than anybody else and really focusing on doing a great job for those people. And I think that sort of mindset, instead of just taking projects that you know you probably shouldn't just to get cash in the door, you need to focus on the right projects that are a good fit for you. And that yields a whole host of benefits, both for your team, yourself, and just your general happiness. And I think it's also the best possible way to be successful.
Thank you. And now moving to you, diversifying. As head of communication, you're in charge of marketing for your companies. What tips can you give our audience on how to make themselves more marketable and market basically their business?
So I wouldn't even tap into the technical side of things, because I bet every single one of you can just Google in how to become a better content writer or whatnot in Google, and all these things would come up, like SEOs and create constant content and whatnot. So what I, in my experience, work for the company that I work for, Hopla, is that when you market something, when you market a product, a business, or even yourself, you have to go back to the reason why you created that business or why you went into that profession in the first place. And what's important is to share that story in your website, in your content, in your work. And when you tap into the emotional side of the person, when you tap into that these things, they would stick. And these things attract people. And so I think that's what's important, to share, to constantly go back to your why, and to share that why into your clients.
Thank you. So David, that leaves us time for one last question. We're seeing more and more demand coming from Australia, from SMBs and bigger companies. It would be great to hear some of your insights. How can our audience contact Australian companies, how to work with them to get more deals?
Okay, so yeah, Australia is a great market for Filipinos to target for some of the reasons I mentioned in one of my earlier answers, to do with the time zone proximity and the general proximity. I should preface this by saying that I'm actually a New Zealander who is usually mistaken for an Australian. I don't bother to correct that usually. Unless people are complaining about Australians, then I point out that I'm a New Zealander, but most of the time I'm fine. I guess the way to look at that is that so much, although it's an English-speaking country, so much in the Philippines is American style, for obvious reasons, because of the history. The style of English that is spoken is American style. A lot of government institutions seem to mirror American institutions in some ways. The HMO system seems to be a copy of the American system. And Australians are a little bit different. If I was to summarize it, I would say that they are more direct, and they prefer a little bit less, my American co-panelist is chuckling here, they prefer a little bit less window dressing. You know, if you go to a restaurant in the United States, someone will emerge at your table and say, "Hi, my name's Sandy, I'm going to be your waitress for tonight," and then give you about a 5-minute spiel about what's going to happen, and then you can't get them away, they keep coming into your table. It's like, "No, leave us to eat our food," you know. And in Australia, it's not like that. The waiter just comes and gives you your food, and it doesn't really interfere any more than they need to. And it's an example of, I guess, window dressing that you get a lot more of in the US. When I'm dealing with business partners, companies that are selling me something, often like, you know, you're having a relationship with an account manager from an American company, and there seems to be a spiel that they go into. You eventually get to the direct side of it. I mean, it's not like they don't get there eventually, but there's this kind of window dressing spiel where they have to say, "So, is there anything else you would like to discuss now? You know, and have I satisfied," that kind of that typical outsourcing question, "Have we satisfied you with our service?" You know, Australians like to cut to the chase. They like to hear it a bit more directly, and they'll be more blunt with you. They're very nice people, but it's just generally all about getting to the nuts and bolts of it. And the advice I gave earlier about being candid about how you handle failure and candid about things that go wrong applies particularly well in that context, because you're going to be dealing with a lot more SMEs or MSMEs. That's a new term I learned from an earlier speaker. And again, they have less corporate stuff going on, less rigid protocol that they have to follow, and really they just want to find out how you're going to deal with their problem. And so dispense with all the window dressing, dispense with any of that kind of stuff, and just basically come across and cut to the chase. I think that's the single biggest thing that you can learn with Australians. And beyond that also, try and use a little bit of Australian English, right? You know, it's called a rubbish bin, not a trash can. Things like that. There's a lot of words that are used differently, and if you can throw in a few Australian words, then certain words that only Aussies use, that will endear you to them as well. So just try and tailor your message. And lastly, I'll just say, do a bit of research, have a little bit of geographical awareness. If you're talking to an Australian and they mention Melbourne or Perth, if you've got no idea where those places are, if they mean nothing to you, if they're just words on a page, that sort of shows that you're not really thinking specifically about that company. But if you've learned a little bit about the basics of geography, that's also going to endear you to prospective clients in Australia a great deal.
Thanks, and actually I think these advisors can apply to any country across the globe, and I think this is the idea from this panel. To really think about your customer, think from customer perspective, what would they like, how can you customize your service, or at least make them feel as if it's customized. So thank you very much for sharing your perspective. Thank you.